Started with today's webinar. Welcome to today's presentation on the CSIR technical report on mobility. I am today very, very grateful that I have with me Professor Linda Godfrey from the CSIR, as well as Rafilia, Mashudu, and Anik, who are going to take you through the technical report. And I'm going to just quickly jump through the matters of circularity. I think some of you have already joined us, so you kind of know how the webinars are facilitated. Then I'm going to hand over to Professor Linda Godfrey before we're handing over to actually present the ins and out of the technical report. And then right at the end, we have a Q&A session. If you can, please use the Q&A function of the MS Teams. You can obviously also post the questions in the chat, but it just makes it a little bit neater to have it in a Q&A section. So let's jump right into it. Circular South Africa, we have been created to amplify the potential and value of the just circular economy across South Africa. And why a circular economy? Well, South Africa is an extractive-based economy. So we are suffering from resource depletion, social inequality, and environmental degradation. And a study by UCT has found that, well, we are very much focused on extracting our resources and exporting them. We are very much dominated by fossil fuels, as you are all aware. We are a very coal-dependent country. We invest very little into our domestic stock building, meaning our development of our infrastructure, especially if we compare it to countries like China or the European Union. The pockets of circularity that are out there are mainly facilitated by the informal sector when we are looking at packaging and packaging waste. And then the fifth finding of the study around circularity was really that, yes, we have a biomass flow that's taking place in our country. However, there the concerns is around the monoculture, agriculture, but also forestry sector that we have, while we are also still having quite a bit of issues around food waste and loss along the supply chains and the value chains. So at the moment, South Africa is around about 6% circular, so we are slightly below the global average, but it also means there's 94% opportunities in the system, as I see it, to really change the system that we currently are having into a more circular economy system. So we believe that circular economy provides South Africa with a regenerative alternative to the current linear model. And we are obviously following the three fundamental principles that are also globally followed around designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials as their highest value, regenerating natural systems, and especially for South Africa, benefiting all members of society is a principle we are always adding as well. So the circular economy really provides a cross-sectoral systems approach. And there are opportunities that are actually interconnected between the sectors. And as Linda will also present, the CSIR and the resource-intensive sectors are really around agriculture, human settlements, manufacturing, mobility, mining, water, and energy. And today we are looking at mobility, really looking at, okay, how can we design our mobility sector, focusing a bit more around the users and the goods rather than the actual vehicles that are on our roads. Next week, we are going to have a quick lunch club around mobility where we're presenting a case study and where we're diving a little bit deeper into this infographic that we have created. That infographic is also based on research that the CSIR has done and is available on our knowledge platform to everyone who is a member of Circular South Africa. So if you want to explore a little bit more about the infographic, please have a look. You can download it and also use it for your own pursuit. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Linda.
Thanks very much, Katrina. Let me quickly share my screen. Just 2 slides I want to quickly present, just to make sure that we leave sufficient time for while we're all here. Just checking that you can see that.
Yeah, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. So always a pleasure to partner with Circular South Africa in terms of sharing the CSIR's research and raising awareness around the various publications that we've produced to date and what brings us to being here today. So I think the context for the various studies that the CSIR has undertaken has really been the government's position with regards to the circular economy. In terms of addressing our growing resource challenges, achieving national climate and sustainability commitments, but also very importantly, the opportunities around creating new socio-economic opportunities, whether it be new circular businesses or business models. And we see this spelled out in more detail in government's white paper on science, technology and innovation, and also in their latest 10-year decadal plan that recognizes the circular economy as one of 5 priority focus areas. And as a result, because of that, essentially the foundation that was set within government policy, the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation and the CSIR asked this question: what does the circular economy mean for South Africa as a developing country? Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? And so around about 5 years ago, we started this journey. We produced a series of 8 short briefing notes, an introductory briefing note on what is the circular economy, and then looking at 7 resource-intensive sectors. Those were consolidated into an open access book, which talks about the circular economy as development opportunity, and something I'm very passionate about in terms of essentially defining Africa's development trajectory and future. And then over the last 5 years, we've published a series of technical reports, sort of deep dives into each of these resource sectors. The first one was around understanding whether resource scarcity was a driver for South Africa to transition to a more circular economy, and it found that it was. The second was whether climate mitigation was a driver to transition, and similarly, it showed that circular interventions had very much a stabilizing effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And then we looked at agriculture and manufacturing, the opportunities and the various circular interventions that we can find in those sectors. That was followed by 2 more publications which looked at energy and water. And then lastly, we left human settlements and mobility until the end, because they're probably the most complex in terms of circular economy. They include a lot of the circular interventions addressed in the other studies, but they're probably also the 2 sectors that have the biggest potential for circular intervention. And so these 2 reports were published late February. I think it was about 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken. A week ago, we had the human settlements lunchtime presentation. And today to present the last of the CSIR studies, which is around mobility. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass it to the CSIR team led by Refilwe to actually take us through the content of that report. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Katarina. And good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today as we explore the opportunities for circular economy interventions and what that means for South Africa's mobility sector. Today, we will be presenting our main findings that are detailed within the mobility technical report that Prof. Linda has explained and given a background on. That was published last month. And so please feel free to also have a look at that when you're able to. Today, I'm also joined by Anika and Mashudu, who will be presenting at various points within the presentation within today's webinar on the macroeconomic impact modeling assessment that we did, as well as the high-level systems dynamic modeling and the key findings that were found from those modeling techniques. I would also at this point wish to extend my acknowledgements and contributions and sincere thanks to the rest of the project team who are not necessarily presenting today, but hopefully they are present within the meeting. And I think that also just speaks to the broad nature of the mobility space. And hopefully we were able to provide meaningful and innovative contributions that represent the wide sector accordingly. And so today, I think we can just get straight into it, where we will be exploring how South Africa's mobility sector can grow equitably, sustainably, and resiliently, and how the circular economy can provide a pathway to do that. Briefly, these are the contents of today's presentation. where we will be looking at what the circular economy is and what does that mean for mobility. Then Anika will take us through the macroeconomic contributions of the sector, and then we will start to explore the actual interventions that were identified for the circular economy space within the mobility, and where we can start to implement and where we are most ready and where the most benefits can be realized from the circular economy. And then Mashudu will briefly take us through the high-level systems modeling outputs of the selected circular economy interventions on the overall mobility system before our concluding remarks and then the question and answer section. So again, what is the circular economy? I believe there is some familiarity as to what the circular economy might be already, given some of the other reports and studies that have been done and the popularity of the subject. But what does that mean for mobility? Currently, the transport sector is structured around a traditional and linear economy model that relies on initial resource extraction and after the use phase goes through disposal and generates quite a large number, a large quantity of waste. And the general thinking is that this is an unsustainable practice and approach, and it has an overall negative impact on the system, including high greenhouse gas emissions, degradation of the environment, as well as economic and systemic inefficiencies. And so a circular mobility system, on the other hand, prioritizes efficiency, waste reduction, and the optimal use and reuse of resources. And so by adopting a circular economy approach that are founded on certain principles, we can begin to think about how do we design out waste by keeping materials and products in use for longer, and in doing so, help to regenerate natural systems. And this then presents an opportunity to rethink how we can optimize our transport systems and prolong the life cycle of resources. Through shifting towards a circular economy, we can start to address issues like high emission reduction, enhancing the system's resilience, and unlocking certain economic opportunities while ensuring a sustainable future for the country's transport sector. On the principles of the circular economy, the first one is looking at optimizing transport systems and intentionally designing out the waste. And this provides an immediate opportunity area for decoupling the sector from high resource consumption by keeping resource and the optimal use of resources in mind. An example of this can include improved vehicle efficiency, the use of hybrid vehicles, as well as modal shifts, excuse me, which have been reported to show the largest potential for emission savings by improving system inefficiencies within the sector, and that can also be beneficial by considering the interdependent relationship between vehicles and the infrastructure interaction, where aspects like road surface roughness and overall infrastructure can actually affect the rolling resistance and therefore the fuel consumption of vehicle, just as an illustration, and thereby having an impact on emissions. And given the large flow of traffic on our roads, a modal shift is vital in making this happen. This includes passenger transport modal shifts and improved use of integrated transport systems through mobility as a service as well as shared mobility. There is also an opportunity to shift to alternative vehicles and EVs that are supported through renewable energy, and they can also present an opportunity to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and so contributing to climate mitigation strategies and international commitments. The second principle, the second key principle within the circular economy for mobility is keeping materials in use. And the mobility sector has numerous opportunities for us to facilitate greater reuse, repair, remanufacturing, and recycling of materials. An example of this is with vehicle remanufacturing, which is the process of manufacturing vehicles from end-of-life fleets, which would have otherwise been scrapped. And some studies have actually shown that this can result in a financial saving of between 30 and 50%, as well as doubling the fleet life of vehicle. And understanding current and future user needs is, of course, vital towards understanding and rethinking that approach on restorative design. Lastly, on regenerating natural systems, this relies and thinks about how do we restore the social and ecological systems to a healthy state by enabling these systems to evolve. And these rely on designing for the environment as well as incorporating nature-based solutions. So coming back to our study, the goal ultimately was to identify circular economy interventions that are tailored for South African mobility sector to assess their readiness for real-world implementation. The aim is to highlight potential socio-economic benefits and develop a strategic framework that will help guide our transition towards a low carbon and sustainable growth while enhancing the efficiency and the resilience of the mobility sector. And so our study focused on identifying these interventions within the mobility space through engaging with stakeholders and leveraging data-driven insights. Our aim was to identify a strategy that can pave the way forward for a low carbon, sustainable economic growth path. And this was conducted initially through a desktop study to evaluate the interventions that have been implemented internationally, as well as globally, as well as locally, and assessing how each of these interventions impacts the various subsectors of the mobility systems through systems dynamic modeling analysis, and also engaging with stakeholders through an online questionnaire and targeted stakeholder interviews, which we will dive into in much detail later. So when we look at the current state of South Africa's mobility sector as a backdrop, it is considered to be an economic powerhouse, or it can be considered as such, and it contributes to around 8% of the country's GDP. And so it's also a critical component of connecting businesses, workers, and communities. However, the sector is highly reliant on road transportation. The 2020, the latest National Household Travel Survey, also revealed that more than 10 million people are using taxis, just above 6 million people are driving in private vehicles. But even more than that, just over 17 million of South Africans are walking all the way to their destinations. For many, especially in urban areas, public transport remains unaffordable. We found through this desktop study that taxis remain the backbone of urban mobility for a large number of South Africans, and they handle about 80% of work-related public transport. But the system is plagued by high costs, there are safety concerns, and a lack of formal oversight. Meanwhile, the rail and bus systems continue to decline. Trains, which were once central to mobility, have lost nearly 2/3 of their household users in under a decade due to safety issues and poor maintenance. And all of this plays out against the backdrop of spatial inequality inherited from the country's past, which has left many disconnected from jobs and services. So while mobility is vital to the economy, it's clear that the current path can be considered to be unsustainable, both from a social perspective as well as environmentally. And there is a pressing need to reimagine and rethink the system into one that's more inclusive, one that's more efficient, and one that's more sustainable. At this point, I would like to hand over to Annika, who will take us a little bit further into the sector contribution to South Africa's economy through the findings of a macroeconomic impact assessment model. Over to you, Annika.
Thanks, Refilwe. So as Refilwe just touched on right now, the mobility sector plays a crucial role in our economy. And this is because no sector is able to function without transport. And just to give some perspective, our data indicates that the transport and storage sector accounts for over 20% of the citrus industry's operating expenses, just as an example. But in addition to supporting all of these sectors, the transport and storage sector, or the mobility sector, also contributes directly to our economy. So our team completed a macroeconomic impact analysis in order to determine or to quantify the significance of the mobility sector, and also to highlight the opportunity and need for interventions. The analysis also forms the basis for future modeling in order to determine the impact of and potential feasibility of circular economy interventions. Now, to do the analysis, we used a model developed by Conningraph economists. And before I explain the model, it's just important to note that we use the transport and storage sector as the sector within this model that best represents the mobility sector. And we also estimated that this sector had experienced an annual turnover of just over 1.1 trillion in the year 2023. Next slide, please, Refilwe. So the macroeconomic model takes a macro perspective of the economy, and it consists of an input-output table that considers 116 different commodity industries. And this input-output table is fully aligned with the country's national accounts that's published by the South African Reserve Bank. And what this basically means is that this table captures the flow of economic activity within these sectors, and it allows the model to determine the relationships between various inputs and outputs. And ultimately, it allows the model to be able to determine the impact of industry-specific investments, or in this case, the contribution of an entire sector. Then the model expresses these outputs in terms of key environmental, social, and economic parameters from a national as well as a sectoral perspective. Now, important inputs required by the model includes the sector's annual turnover as well as its socioeconomic structure. And some of the elements within this structure that needs to be included is, for example, the employment split, the economic split, and the value share of the sector's operating inputs. As shown, we can see, for example, in the transport industry that 19% of all of the jobs in this industry or sector is fulfilled by unskilled laborers and 52% by semi-skilled laborers. Thanks, Refilwe. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the results or some of the results of the analysis. In other words, some of the total contributions of the mobility sector. As you can see, the sector is supporting 3.5 million jobs. About 26% of this 3.5 million is due to the direct impact of the TAS sector, whereas the remaining portion is due to the ripple effect of activities within the TAS sector. So this is, for example, due to businesses that support or provide support to transport-related activities. Then the TAS sector is also responsible for the investment in assets with about 2.5 trillion, and it also contributed just over 1.1 trillion to the country's total GDP. And this again includes the direct impact as well as the ripple effect of transport and mobility related activities. Then lastly, it increases state revenue with around 380 billion. And this amount typically allows the government to fund just over or around 3,000 doctors and 84,500 educators, just to name a few social factors. Next slide, please, Refilwe. So this slide shows the estimated greenhouse gas emissions as estimated by the model. As seen, the transport and storage sector contributes just over 100 megatons of CO2 equivalent, of which carbon dioxide is the majority, as expected. And this just emphasizes the need and opportunity to implement circular economy interventions from an environmental perspective. Thank you, Refilwe. You can continue.
Thank you, Anika. At this point in the presentation, I will now be diving into the circular economy opportunities that were identified for the mobility sector, as well as discussing what the stakeholder insights and readiness for implementation was when we engaged with them. So when we had, when we had a look at how circular economy interventions can be applied across the different components of the mobility system, it became very clear that we were not necessarily going to find a single silver bullet that can address all the facets that exist within the sector. And we had to critically assess interventions down to a subsystem perspective. And when we start with passenger transport, a key focus area for the circular economy, here the aim was to find interventions that can reduce the reliance on private vehicles and shift towards more sustainable modes of transportation. Firstly, this includes the concept of the 15-minute cities, where essential services are ideally located within a short walking or cycling distance and thereby reducing the need for motorized travel. Secondly, is embracing, in which I think we have, flexible working arrangements to an extent, and this can help to reduce peak travel demand. And lastly, under this umbrella is shifting passengers to public transport, to public transportation systems, which is a core strategy that supports energy efficiency, reduces emissions, and when done right, can actually boost productivity. Next, looking at vehicles, which remain central to South African mobility landscape, the circular interventions that were identified here included the increased use of hybrid and electric vehicles that can assist to reduce emissions over their life cycle, enhancing vehicle efficiency through better design and maintenance, and using alternative fuels like biofuels and hydrogen, and importantly, dealing with the vehicles at the end of their life. Through interventions such as refurbishing and recycling, this can assist to reduce waste and recover valuable materials. And so these strategies not only help to mitigate climate impact, but especially as we engaged with our stakeholders, we realized that this particular space can assist in opening up new opportunities for local manufacturing and job creation within a circular value chain. Next, within the freight subsystem or freight transport subsystem, we identify the intervention that's very well known of shifting freight from road to rail, which will assist in relieving congestion and reducing road maintenance costs while significantly lowering the emissions. Under supply chains, the interventions that were identified here as critical to the mobility ecosystem overall included firstly promoting shorter supply chains that will assist in reducing the transportation and haulage distances as well as associated emissions. Secondly, under circular supply chains, this is where materials are reused and remanufactured, and in doing so can be minimized. The waste that's produced can be minimized at each stage. There's also process optimization that ensures freight logistics are more efficient with fewer empty trips and better route planning. These interventions can leverage and be made more viable through mobility as a service, or better known as MaaS, a platform which is based on integrating various modes of transportation into a single system for the benefit of the end user. MaaS platforms can be used to coordinate for things like freight schedules, reducing duplication, and facilitating shared infrastructure. And together with freight interventions, these supply side changes can be leveraged to drive efficiency and sustainability gains. Last but not least, the interventions that were identified under the transport infrastructure umbrella, which form the backbone, the physical backbone of mobility in any case. And the interventions that were identified here include building climate resilient infrastructure that can withstand extreme weather events, especially with the growing concerns of climate change, using alternative road materials like recycled asphalt or plastic-based composites, where the use of waste or traditional waste materials is incorporated more into the actual road building and building up of our transport infrastructure. Also sustainable urban drainage systems, which are a system developed to manage the runoff and protect the road during flooding events. As well as developing dedicated pedestrian and cycle facilities to encourage low impact travel. And together, these circular interventions allow for a more sustainable and inclusive, resilient mobility system that is within reach. But to get there, we do require integrated planning, connecting modes of transportation, collaborative stakeholder engagements, and technologies that are underpinned by enabling policies, innovation, and public engagement. And through engaging with the industry experts and practitioners, we captured a diverse perspective on how various circular interventions could be effectively integrated into our local mobility space. And the findings from these interactions contribute to a nuanced understanding of the potential for circular initiatives. And they also assist in serving a solid foundation for developing targeted strategies that aim at transforming the country's mobility space. Recognizing the diversity of the mobility sector and with its many relevant subsectors, the stakeholder engagement was a key focus for our study. And we emphasized that the feedback and results from the study need to be meaningful and representative of this diversity. Ultimately, this effort creates a sound and empirical basis to support our proposed recommendations for interventions, whether it's in policy or in practical implementation, and bring us closer to a circular transition within the mobility space. So in terms of who we heard from, just to give you a quick snapshot of the respondents and participants, as I mentioned, it did include a diverse and seasoned group of professionals from across the mobility ecosystem. When we looked at the type of organization, most of the respondents did come from government stakeholders, which include national, provincial, and municipal level participants, which highlight the conversations that were taking place within the public sector. In terms of the role, the majority of participants were working at a strategic or a technical level within the transportation systems, which included planning and policy development to engineering design and so forth. And when it came to the circular economy knowledge, most stakeholders were not starting from scratch, and most of the respondents reported having some working knowledge of the circular economy principles, suggesting a strong foundation for building deeper applied circular economy practices within the transport space. And finally, from a sectoral experience point of view, the large majority of the respondents had over a decade of experience, which indicates the depth of insights that were gathered from the individuals who have been in the sector and are relatively well positioned to identify what's working and what may not. And so, taken together, this group brought both institutional memory within the sector and an openness to change. So, their insights reflect some of their real world experiences and cross cutting across the sector. So, when we assessed the interventions and we engaged with the stakeholders on the circular economy interventions that were presented in the previous slides, we were able to explore the relevance of the circular of these interventions, and it allowed us to gauge how familiar respondents were with some of the key concepts. The most well-known interventions were the electric and hybrid vehicles, shifting from road to rail, and climate resilient infrastructure, which is likely reflective of the ongoing conversations within policy and media. And some of the interventions, like 15-minute cities, were not too familiar with the respondents. And looking at the most appropriate interventions, the first was shifting freight to from road to rail, which can offer sustainability and cost benefits. However, there are some inefficiencies within the rail system that need to be addressed and can serve as major barriers. Second, shifting passengers to public transport was found to be critical. And while the existing minibus taxi industry is an asset, the system needs upgrades in safety, comfort, and reliability to gain public trust. Thirdly, climate resilient infrastructure supported by alternative road materials shows some promise, but without the large scale local testing and incentives on the use of alternative materials, we found that their impact can be limited after engaging with stakeholders. Overall, these insights gave us some grounded sense of where uptake is most feasible and where the sector we need to build some momentum. But despite some of these differences in familiarity, there was broad agreement that circular practices could benefit South Africa's mobility sector. And stakeholders identified rail freight, improved public transport, and climate resilient infrastructure as the most impactful interventions for the local context. When we look at readiness versus implementation, this reveals where South Africa could focus immediate efforts to achieve the greatest impact. In terms of what is ready to scale, stakeholders highlighted that several interventions showed readiness for implementation in the country and were rated both high in readiness and current implementation. And this included flexible working arrangements, mobility as a service. Thank you to post-COVID adaptations anyway that resulted in a rise of ride-sharing platforms and flexible working arrangements. Climate infrastructure and sustainable urban drainage systems were also indicated to be high on the readiness, but haven't yet been scaled up to see that widespread implementation. And on the low readiness, but big potential, some more complex systemic shifts like shifting freight to rail, transitioning to alternative fuels, and implementing 15-minute cities were rated on the lower end in terms of readiness and implementation, and pointed out to institutional infrastructure and economic hurdles. In terms of whether we can build 15-minute cities or not that are inclusive was a bit of a tough ask, simply because our cities were found to not have been designed for it simply. And but with new developments, they do hint at what may be possible if this is invested in from a strategic point of view. In terms of what we know what works, but we're not doing yet, even when readiness is high, implementation is sometimes slow. This includes climate resilient infrastructure, which was indicated as a top priority. But given some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier, the implementation is scarce. And from what we can see, some of these lost opportunities result from a lack of coordination amongst key stakeholders um, that was preventing that. And so based on stakeholder insights on familiarity, perceived benefits, readiness, and current levels of implementation, we identified key interventions to model through a systems dynamic lens. And these interventions were not just popular, but they were seen as capable of shifting the system if key barriers can be addressed. And these are briefly the interventions that were the top 5 interventions that were identified and then modeled through the systems dynamic modeling, which Mashudu will be taking us through next. Thanks, Mashudu.
Thank you, Refilwe. Next slide, please. Yes, a system dynamics model was developed based on fundamental principles and the structure of the transport system. The model was aimed at describing complex links and interactions between key components of the transport system, offering a structure for simulating and analyzing the dynamic behavior of the transport system. Next slide, please. So this is a causal loop diagram. This is potentially a mind map that shows those complex links and interactions and key components that I spoke about in the previous slide. So if you can see here in the slide presented, amongst other variables, we investigated the links between the population, private transport usage, public transport usage, budget, transport budget, emission, and also the use of electric vehicles. Next slide, please. And as Refilwe indicated, when we spoke to stakeholders, they indicated 5 key circular economic interventions, which we then studied. The first one was dedicated bicycle and pedestrian facilities and shifting freight from road to rail and shifting passengers to public transportation, hybrid or electric vehicles, and flexible working arrangements. Next slide, please. I'm just waiting for everything to load. Okay, so what the model yielded was quite interesting because it actually showed that investing in rail infrastructure and the operational efficiency of rail infrastructure will lead to increased rail usage. However, we are not only going to be able to see we're not going to be able to see the benefits emerge in the coming years, in soon years. So we were able to note that there will be a 10-year delay before tangible benefits emerge. And we also show, the model also showed that there were also circular economic interventions that were impactful in improving efficiency in mobility because of decreasing the energy consumptions. And those interventions were interventions like shifting freight from road to rail, shifting passenger to public transport, hybrid or electric vehicles, and flexible working arrangements. However, it was very interesting because we noted in the model that having a dedicated bicycle or pedestrian facility was not going to make an impact if we do not have a sustainable transport system that addresses commuter concerns because people were saying that, yes, the infrastructure could be there. However, they were worried about safety, security, and reliability of the overall transport system. But in overall summarizing what the model actually showed, it showed that changing a single variable within the transport system, or investing within one variable within the transport system, is not going to yield as many benefit. And it is necessary for us as transport planners or anybody dealing in the circular economy space to consider the dynamic, systemic, comprehensive approach to transport planning. And that is the only way we can be able to influence model shift. I'm going to hand back over to Refilwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mashudu. So that gives us a snapshot in terms of the systemic overview. And at this stage in the presentation, I'd like to go into the concluding remarks. And so what we have been able to see and what we demonstrated in the report is that as promising as a circular mobility system is, successfully transitioning to a circular system is not just about introducing isolated initiatives, as the systems modeling also alluded to, but it's about systematically connecting different parts of the transport sector. For instance, in South Africa, shifting transport, freight transport from road to rail cannot happen effectively without close collaboration between the various entities that are involved, including freight operators, road management agencies also, as well as policymakers, and integrating electric vehicles into urban transport similarly depends on coordination among energy providers, automotive manufacturers, and so forth. And without these stakeholders collaboratively planning and aligning their efforts, attempts at circular economy and interventions can become limited and inefficient. There's also some infrastructure investments, key infrastructure investments that were identified that need to occur to support a circular economy, which includes the upgrading of rail networks and establishing nationwide network of EV charging stations as an example to support the transition, as well as prioritizing local manufacturing. Additionally, there's a need for resilient infrastructure that can withstand the increasing frequency of climate disasters, amongst others. And when we look at the interventions with a high job potential, stakeholders were able to provide some of their inputs, and these included spaces like vehicle remanufacturing, battery recycling, expanded public transport systems, local EV production, and infrastructure. And shifting freight from road to rail through producing biofuels also opens up new employment avenues, particularly in rural areas, if this is done deliberately and intentionally. So there was a concern that without this deliberate planning, that job opportunities may only be concentrated in certain areas, particularly in urban centers, and in doing so can widen existing disparities. And so it was very critical that this point was emphasized within the stakeholder engagements, that we need to ensure that there is inclusion, and this means embedding rural participation in infrastructure and clean mobility transitions. And so one of the major wins, besides the enhanced productivity and competitiveness of the sector, is the job creation opportunities and skills development that can emerge from a circular mobility system. On the positive side, embracing a circular economy can lead to significant gains, such as these that have been mentioned. which is vital for fostering a capable workforce. Additionally, transitioning can enhance productivity that benefits the broader economy, but it doesn't come without its hurdles and challenges, which can include some resistance from traditional industries, which may slow down integration and innovation. So we need clear strategies on how to bring these game players on board. And they can also be an initial financial barrier, which can limit implementation and the far-reachingness of these implementations. And as we look ahead, we've structured our recommended circular economy interventions into 4 distinct but interconnected areas. Firstly, looking at which circular economy interventions can we fast track, which include the high readiness, such as climate resilient infrastructure and sustainable urban drainage systems, which was found to be on the lower side of implementation, but demonstrated high readiness. On what we can build momentum on initiatives like flexible working arrangements, mobility as a service, and ride sharing, as well as dedicated bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, which are starting to gain traction. These can be strategically scaled up to build on their current acceptance and effectiveness. And thirdly, on the strategic interventions which require deliberate and long-term planning and targeted investment, including EV infrastructure, incentives for adopting alternative designs, and integrated planning strategies for development of concepts like the 15-minute cities. And finally, to support all these interventions, a clear and consistent policy or a connection of policies and leveraging off of existing policies. Stakeholders identified the need for stronger financial incentives and subsidies for green mobility options. And enhanced coordination across the sectors and specific strategies to ensure that there is inclusion, particularly in rural areas. And so the summary of our findings, as the last slide, there was a need for a comprehensive circular economy approach, which does not necessarily rely on another policy that needs to be developed, but just a collaborative approach. And on that point, there is an importance that the necessary stakeholders are collaborated and sitting at the table to discuss what the next steps would be, so that the current challenges are appropriately addressed. In terms of what's next, I think a lot of these interventions are not necessarily starting from scratch. A lot of these interventions are familiar within the sector. We do have tools, we have examples, we have ideas. All we need now is alignment across the sectors and across communities. And so as we move forward, it's imperative that we work collectively to overcome some of the challenges that are facing our transport system and seize this as an opportunity that's being presented by the circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this was incredibly insightful to all the sharing that you, all the research that you have done, the modeling that you have done around it, bringing to the forefront interventions that we are aware of, but that need to actually be implemented as well. I was wondering if, because we are starting to run a bit late, if anyone has a question, if you want to put up your hand and ask it to our experts on the leave the floor to people online. So you can put up your hand or just post a question into the chat as well. Renuka, I think, can you unmute yourself? Let me just give, allow mic. I think now you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was listening, but I arrived here a little bit late. However, I did one study, like not me, but one of my colleague has done a study, and we are looking into it now more into more details. You know, gig economy. Do you understand what is gig economy?
Maybe you can give a quick recap.
Okay,
but
just
please
like
also keep your
Uber
questions
or
very short.
you
Thank
know
you.
the people who deliver our food from one place to another and so on. So they are on a very short contract, and they do plenty of you know, essential work within the supply chain. And so it is a big part of transport, because say for example, I have ordered my food online, and a small a contractor would go to the hotel and bring that food to me. So he is only contracted for a very small part of that whole supply chain. And so we did a study, and we found that there is a huge such type of small contracts happening in the transport and in various sectors. And then we analyzed, especially for 3 months, the people who take these food services, like serve the food industry, and we studied their carbon emissions. And we found that we hardly even know or count on 10% of emissions that are happening. And maybe we are able to pay one or the other way through our taxis or other services and so on. Say, for example, if you are flying from one country to another, we do pay sometimes a carbon offset for the travel, flights. And that is what we are saying here. So within the long supply chain, there are many stakeholders, and we don't know, or we do not have exact idea who should be responsible to pay these. Even in this type of supply chain, we use internet also to book our tickets and book our food and so on. So there are hidden emissions, but we don't know. And so who would pay, and how we can establish some actual carbon emissions happening through this gig economy. So that is my question. If anyone has an idea, have done study or something like that, then please share with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Renuka. I think because it was a statement and a question, I can ask our experts if they have any literature to share that with you. But I think that also speaks a lot to aircrafts and the transport happening internationally. And I think the study was very strongly focused also in the South African national context. So maybe I'll hand over to Sintle for one question, but please, Sintle, keep it very short and brief. Let me quickly also unmute you so that you can have the mic. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Just a quick question. I did see the taxi industry was included there specifically, and also know they're part of the public transportation system. But I see that my question is, since they are there's my opinion, the biggest impediment in terms of they are known to be volatile and violent in their efforts to stop anything that's messing with their business. Were they seriously considered or investigated as one of the biggest impediment to any circular economy intervention? Because I think they affect everything or every initiative that would be proposed or would be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sintle. I'm not sure who wants to take this question on the taxi industry. Thank you.
I can briefly take that question. So that was something that was considered and identified as a potential barrier for, in particular, the circular economy intervention of mobility as a service. So increasingly, we've seen that people and organizations are becoming more reliant on mobility as a service, as a single platform that can assist in their transport needs. And this can be often perceived as a threat by the taxi industry. So it was something that was identified as a potential barrier. And so in moving forward, it's something that would need the correct buy-in from the taxi industry and the appropriate level of consultation and engagement with them.
Thank you. I see one more last question. Maybe we can take it because I see still a few people are online, and that is from Ronald. I think it's also a bit more of a statement, but / question. What could really revolutionize the transport sector to circularity is change in ownership models. Did the study look into this? Ronald, I'm not sure if you want to expand on a question quickly as well. What do you mean by ownership in general? Who owns which portion of the sector? Just trying to find you online if you're still with us. But otherwise, maybe you can also type in the chat. Otherwise, I'll close the meeting. And you can also follow up with the experts. I think this was an extremely insightful presentation. Thank you so much for making time. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Refulia, Mashudu, and Anika for actually spending the time today with us and sharing your invaluable insights. And I really hope the study is finding some more presence with people that also shape policy, that are also actually in the manufacturing sector, because I think we see this cross linkages quite strongly coming through in the study, but also with the human settlements research that was conducted by the CSIR. Thank you again for collaborating and for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.